So we're going to just chat to you about, this is primarily the adult service, though a lot of this is shared between the pediatric service and the adult service. So pretty much everything you can do in the adult service, we can do in the pediatric service too. We crosstalk, as Pinky said earlier. I sit in the pediatric clinics and we run those together, and we try and get as much crosstalk between the two services as possible so that it is a full service for you. So your children get seen, you get seen, and we try and connect the two as much as we can. So just to give you a very brief, I'm going to give a brief overview of the service in a couple of slides. Prof has already talked about that earlier today. I'm just going to give you a slightly more detailed view. Natalie is then going to give you a nursing overview about the things that she's doing and thinking about doing. Dr. Nagendran is going to give you an overview of the neurophysiology test that a lot of you will have already had or may have in the future. And then Dr. Manako is going to give you an overview of the functional service. So Bino mentioned that we have this excellent functional service, which we use to try and translate what we find in the genetic testing for you all into on the lab side to try and understand what's going on in each and every one of you. So we'll give you an overview of that. So I'm going to get on with my bit. So this is just an expansion of what Prof presented earlier with a few pictures. I'm sorry, Nicola, I don't have a picture of you. But as Prof mentioned, so Prof Hannah and I co-lead the service. Dr. Munnett leads the pediatric side of things. And then Dr. Nagendran, who you're going to hear from very shortly, is our consultant neurophysiologist. He's the one who does all the neurophysiology testing when you come in to see us. And then Vino is our amazing research fellow who's running pretty much all of the trials that's going on at the moment. Natalie, who almost certainly you will all know on the adult side, is our amazing specialist nurse, and Sean, our amazing pediatric nurse. And they really are kind of between all of us, we hold the service together, but the nurses and the physios really do an amazing job. So Sarah and Nicola, Sarah does the adult side and Nicola does the pediatric side, and they're going to give you a bit of a talk a bit later. And then on the research side, Ivona and Louise are our research nurses, so you will almost certainly see them when you come into clinic asking you, to fill out questionnaires and participate in research if you're interested. And then Jean single-handedly looks after pretty much all the administration, and without her, I don't think today would happen. And I'm sure most of you have spoken to her at some point because she's what keeps everything running to clockwork. And then Richa and Rebecca are our genetics team, who I'll mention very briefly about the genetics side of things. And Dr. Manako, as I said, is our scientist who runs the electrophysiology service. All right, so I'm just going to very quickly overview what we do in the channel service in just a little bit more detail than Prof had a bit earlier, just to kind of tease out what we do. So the idea of the service is that the first time you see us, it's a one-stop appointment. Now, sometimes if you live in London, we'll do things in bits and pieces so that we can see you a little bit earlier, because obviously to try and get everything done on one day, sometimes that delays your appointment. So sometimes we'll do things separately, but we try and do as much as we can for those of you who live outside of London in one go. The idea is you get a specialist review with one of us. You get the specialist neurophysiology tests if you need to have them done. If you've had them done before, we won't often do them again. We'll do genetic testing on the day if you need it and you haven't already had it. And then Natalie gives nursing input either on the day or afterwards as needed. And then Sarah is usually around to give physiotherapy input. On the pediatric side, as Dr. Munnett has already said, we have Sean and Nicola giving the nursing and physiotherapy input to the clinics. So after your appointment, what happens? I guess you guys don't really see this side of things. This is all the bits that are frantically going on in the background after you come to clinic and even before you come to clinic. So we have a massive MDT. And in our MDT, we have ourselves, we have the geneticist, we have the neurophysiologist, the nurse, the physiotherapist, the research team, and we all come together before every single clinic and discuss all of your cases, every single one. We go through all your genetics, all your previous test results, and see if what's outstanding, what we think we need to do, whether there are any things that we need to specifically talk to you about in clinic, if there are any worries, if anything had come up with speaking to Natalie or Sarah in the year before, anything at all that we think might be important. So we discuss you before we see you in clinic, and then we discuss everything again after we've seen you to see if there are any things that we need to sort out for you separately. So that all happens in the background with everything. And then in between, and I know one of the problems is that you usually only get to see us once a year, is we try and do touch base appointments for patients who are on treatment, patients who need monitoring with either Natalie or Sarah. And we also have Vino's running some extra clinics as well, where we try and squeeze people in there. So we're trying our best to see you as much as possible. And if you have a problem and you need to see us sooner, just please just email us and we will try and squeeze in some form of appointment for you somewhere. So that's what happens after your appointment. So what else is out there for you? So we have just launched our new Channelopathy website, and I will put the link in the chat after I finish presenting, so that you can click on it and have a look. So the new website is purely for patients with muscle channelopathies and for health professionals. So there's a section for professionals to have a look at so that they understand more about the disease. And if you have a local neurologist or your GP wants more information, you can point them to this website, because actually it has lots of information for them as well as for you. We have a patient section which has lots of information about how top tips, what you can do to help, about physiotherapy, videos for physio, all of the things that we would give you in clinic is on this website. So it's a really good resource for sitting, reading, trying to get a bit more in-depth information. We can only give you so much today because we don't want to overwhelm people. We also have limited time. And I'm very aware of Zoom fatigue, and we're all going to be knackered after this. So it's another way of giving you information about things, and you can just keep going back to it when you need it. And your family can look at it anyway. It's freely available on the internet. So please go and have a look at that and see if there are any questions. All our contact details are on there. You can just email us. They're all there. Our patient information booklet's on there, and I think Vino mentioned it earlier. We have a patient information booklet we try to give out to anyone who has a new diagnosis, but it's also on there on the website. There are the Pilates videos, which I'm sure Sarah and Nicola will talk about, and then there's specific information leaflets for each of the conditions. So please have a look at the website and the leaflets and things that are on there. I'm hoping this is going to go forward. Okay, so that is my summary. Natalie, I'm hoping you are able to unmute and do your bit and I can click you through.
Yep, thank you. Sorry, just a bit of background noise. Yes, right. Okay, so important for patients to remember that I'm actually split between the muscle channel service and one of the other specially commissioned services, the mitochondrial service. So I'm actually half-time in the channel service and half-time doing mitochondrial. So I try and get back to people as quickly as I can, but bear in mind I'm looking after probably nearly 1,000 people on and off. We don't actively see them all, but you know, I'll be contacted by lots of people, so my time is split. Next slide, please. Okay, so we always put the patient at the centre, and as Deep has just shown you, we've got a really big service, but we also put in the community. So it's really important that my role, I can contact community services, guide you, signpost you. I liaise really closely with GPs. I work closely with the research nurses, and then I link in with the paediatric team. I also work with other neuromuscular nurses across the country. So if there are any questions from other centres that have patients with channelopathies, I can link in with them. Next slide, please. So Deep has mentioned that we have the multidisciplinary team meeting. So I take stuff away from the meeting. So if there's things that come up in clinic that I need to action, I'll take that away and do that. But also if I get contacted by patients, or if I'm doing telephone clinics, or I get emails from patients and I can't answer the questions, or I'm a little bit concerned about something, I'll take it back to the MDT. So it's a two-way process, and we're constantly communicating within each other. So I do weekly telephone clinics for patients, and I look at symptom management, help optimize symptom management, and look at sort of ways that to enable people to manage their well-being in the context of their symptoms, because you know, medication's great, but it doesn't completely manage your symptoms. You may still have some. When you start on treatment, I help with medication management, dose adjustment. We may tweak it. I'll link with your GP if we change a dose. patients needing surgery or need emergency plans for, and the ATS patients or hypo-PP patients, I'll do emergency plans for them. We give out anaesthetic advice, written information about your condition for work. We do a lot of signposting for resources, linking to driver assessment centres, lots of other practical things, sort of lots of signposting, linking with community teams, as I've said, and then obviously linking with the GOSH team so that we get the transitioning patients coming through. I don't attend that clinic, but I can link with Sian and say, this patient's coming through, and we'll get a summary, so that at least I get an update on somebody that's coming through. Next slide, please. So in the past, I've looked at pain. A lot of patients report pain with their conditions. So we've looked at that, and that I fed that back at previous patient days, and I can certainly share that with people if they want to have a look at that. But we're looking at what sort of information is required, what sort of information do your employers need, young adults going to university, going to college, additional support, disabled student grants, that sort of information, lots of support letters for that. An area that seems to be coming up when I talk to people in clinic, in my telephone clinic, is about hormonal influences on their muscles. So it's something that we're going to be looking at symptom management, particularly during pregnancy. And then, a lot of what I do is supportive. We give out lots of information leaflets, the alert cards that Sian mentioned. We have those for the adult service as well. So if you haven't got one, please do let us know, and we'll make sure that we get you those. And if you've got any suggestions or want something from the service that we're not providing, please do let us know. If you would like to have appointments with me to go through things, just drop me an email or contact the service, and we can get you booked into a telephone clinic to go through those things. That's great. Thanks, Deepa.
Thanks, Natalie. Now, next is neurophysiology. So I'm hoping Dr. Nagendran's going to come on. Brilliant.
Thanks, Deepa. So my name is Dr. Nagendran. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the neurophysiology service we have. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, the neurophysiology we do for channelopathy patients is nerve conduction studies and EMG. Many of you will have had one, possibly even 2 or 3 by now, of these tests. And essentially what we do is we're looking to investigate the function of your muscles and nerves. Your nerves are a little bit like the body's electric cables. Nerve conduction studies involve giving you small electric pulses and passing these down the nerves to the muscle and measuring the responses that we can get. EMG, which stands for electromyography, is slightly different. Again, we're trying to record electrical activity, but we do this in EMG by putting a fine needle within the muscle, so a couple of millimeters in. And then we make some recordings both at rest, and then we ask you to move the muscle, and we make some more recordings. In patients with channelopathies, some of the sounds that we're looking for are quite characteristic. So within neurophysiology, we talk about myotonia or myotonic discharges, which are typical for patients with myotonia, paramyotonia, even some forms of periodic paralysis. And the studies that we do are typically of the arms and the legs, although the specialized testing that we do is mainly on the hand. Next slide, please. So this is just a photo of the sort of setup you might be going through. So on the left-hand side of the big picture, you can see where the stimulator will be placed, and that's what will be delivering the small electric current. Thanks, Deepa. And on the right-hand side, you can see where the blue stickers are. So those are our surface electrodes. Those are the ones that are picking up the response from the muscle. In this case, this is ADM, so one of the muscles that moves your little finger. And the response that we get is seen in the top right. So one of those yellow traces. And each one is basically a combination of the action potential, the electrical message that goes to the muscle. And we can get several useful bits of information from that. So we can look at the height of it for the size of the response, how long it takes to get there, and so on. On the bottom right, as an example of an EMG needle. So it's really quite a thin needle. If any of you have had acupuncture or a blood test, it's usually similar sort of feeling to that. Sometimes people say it isn't as bad as a blood test. And again, so the needle goes in a few millimeters within the muscle. Next slide, please. Okay, so just coming on to our specialized test that we do for channelopathy patients. Both of the ones I'll talk about basically involve doing some form of exercise, and that's because we know that the muscles behave differently in different muscle channelopathies after exercise. So the long exercise test is most useful when we're suspecting a diagnosis of periodic paralysis or Anderson-Torval syndrome. And what it involves is, after a baseline period, we ask you to do 5 minutes of exercise with your little finger against some resistance. And then after that, you just rest for about 50 minutes, and we deliver a sequence of pulses every minute or every 2 minutes, and just follow up how the response changes. And that we sort of get the traces you can see on the top right-hand side. When we plot the heights, we get the sort of graphs you can see at the bottom. And on the left-hand side, with all the purple dots, that's an example of a normal one. So time is on the bottom axis. And on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, you can see the numbers, which are essentially just a percentage. So on the left-hand side, a normal result would be staying relatively flat or not much decline with time. And on the right-hand side, you can see a typical abnormal one. And what you can see in the after exercise period on the right-hand side is that actually that response gets smaller and smaller after the period of exercise. And that's basically a manifestation of the weakness that patients, for example, with periodic paralysis can get after doing a sustained period of exercise. So the neurophysiology helps bring out that clinical symptom. Next slide, please. And this is another one of the specialized tests. So this is the short exercise test. So again, we're sort of doing some baseline responses, asking you to do some exercise, and then following up to see how the response changes. In this case, the period of exercise is shorter, so only 10 seconds, but we do that repeatedly. So we'll get you to do 10 seconds of exercise, and then during a 1 minute rest period, we'll be doing pulses every 10 or so seconds, and then we'll repeat that a few times. And generally, we do this both at room temperature and then after we've cooled your hand right down on some ice. That can be a little bit uncomfortable, but usually the hand just goes numb, as many of you will know. And just looking at the traces at the bottom, again, that's derived from the height of each one of those traces on the top right-hand side. So on the bottom left is, broadly speaking, what a normal one would look like. So you don't really see much of a change with time. Sometimes it can drift up or drift down a little bit. And on the right-hand side is an example of one from a patient who had recessive myotonia congenita. And what you can see is that after the baseline blue one on the left-hand side, after the first period of exercise, actually the response drops and then recovers, and then that sort of repeats itself after the next 2 periods of exercise to a lesser degree. It's those sorts of, there are different patterns that we look for that you can get with a short exercise test, and often it can help guide us into which kind of myotonia or paramyotonia or sodium channel myotonia that we're looking for. Next slide, please. Okay, so why do we do the neurophysiology testing? So I mean, we tend to do it on the same day as much as possible for new patients. It complements the medical examination you get, and then obviously the genetic testing that most patients will also get. Previously, it used to guide the genetic testing because those testing used to be quite expensive. We used to have to wait a long time for the results to come back. That isn't the case anymore, and it's certainly changing very quickly. So genetic tests return faster, and they're also cheaper to do. But the neurophysiology is still useful, A, just to confirm what we find of the genetics, and B, also just to clarify what the muscles are doing when things are not so clear. So we don't actually get a genetic diagnosis on everyone, even in 2022. Sometimes we don't find a mutation at all. Sometimes we get multiple mutations, and sometimes we actually get mutations and we don't know what they mean, or they're not in they're novel ones in a place that we haven't come across them before. And in all those cases, neurophysiology is quite well established. It doesn't tell us everything, but we know what it does and doesn't tell us. And it helps as part of the puzzle, basically. And that's it, really. So, I mean, hopefully we don't have to, it's not too hard to get through. Many of you will have it. It can take, usually somewhere between 1 and 2 hours to complete. We don't tend to do it repeatedly unless there's a reason to do it. But yeah, hopefully it wasn't something that any of you found too difficult to get through. Thanks,
Arjuna. All right. So I'm going to very quickly talk about genetic testing, and then I'll hand over to Dr. Manako. So unfortunately, the genetic team couldn't be here today, so I'm just going to quickly go through some genetics, the genetic side of things that we do in clinic. So why do we do genetic testing? Well, as I spoke about earlier today, all the channelopathies we see are inherited, and they're due to a mistake in your DNA coding, which tells your body what proteins to make and how to make it. So which type of channelopathy you have depends on which mistake you have in which gene. And the importance about knowing about the mistake is it tells us a lot of things. First of all, it tells us what your chances of passing on the problem to your children, tells us what treatments might benefit you the most, but also it can help us understand what factors, what things might trigger or improve your symptoms. So it's really important for helping us to help you. So how do we do the genetic testing? Now, I'm pretty sure all of you will have had this at some point, but just to quickly go over it, it's just a blood test. So we take a blood test, we get a sample of DNA from your blood test, and then pretty much all of the genetic testing we do as part of this clinic goes to the lab in Great Ormond Street Hospital. And what they do nowadays, it's changed over the years. And those of you who would have had genetic testing a long time ago, we would have tested individual genes, but now we test a panel of genes. So we look at all of the known muscle channelopathy genes in your DNA to see if there are any mistakes in them. And then we have a look at that mistake if we find one, and we have a look and see if have we seen it before? Have we seen it in a patient with a similar symptoms to what you have, or were they different? In what context have we seen it before? Have we seen it in people who don't have any symptoms at all? And so what does it mean? So most of you will have had this type of panel testing if you've come through to the service recently. Sometimes if you have a family member who already has a diagnosis, we'll only test for that particular change because it's a lot quicker. So it takes usually less than a month to get those results back, whereas for the panel testing can take 4 to 6 months. So it takes a bit of time because there are a lot of genes, a lot of mistakes to look at. So what are the problems with genetic testing? Well, one problem is, as Arjuna just mentioned, is sometimes we don't find the mistake in your DNA that's causing the problem. And when that happens, we look and see if we can find a mistake in other genes, slightly different genes. We might do other investigations. We might do the neurophysiology testing again, or in a slightly different way. So if we don't find a mistake, we have to go looking a bit more. If we find a mistake in your gene that we've never seen before, then it makes things a little bit trickier because we can't always be 100% certain that it's the thing that's causing your condition. So what we might do is we might say to you, can we test your parents and see if they have the same problem, the same mistake, but don't have symptoms? And then what we do is this functional testing that Dr. Manako is going to talk about in a minute, is we can take the genetic mistake to the lab and have a look and see what happens if you put that mistake into a special setup. What does that do to the protein? If we find a mistake that we've seen before, but you have slightly different symptoms, that can be a bit confusing as well. So often, again, we'll ask to test your parents. We might do further investigations to try and work out if the mistake that we've seen is what's actually causing your condition. All right, so that was my very quick whiz through genetic testing. I'm hoping Dr. Manako is going to come on. Brilliant. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can share.
Right. So yeah, I'm a scientist doing electrophysiological studies on ion channels. So hopefully this is comprehensible. So as mentioned, ion channels are encoded by ion channel genes. So the short piece of DNA contains all the information to make these ion channel proteins. Here you see ions inside the sort of pore from above, and here they are going through the channel. And then if you have a mistake in your ion channel gene, that can cause to change in the structure of the ion channel protein, and that might affect on how the ions pass through the channel. And my job is basically to find evidence if the mistakes that you find in the genes affect the function of the ion channel. And so when we do this, so you have bioelectricity. So we have ions in the body, basically salts that have an electric charge, so they can carry electricity. So if you put salts in water, the water is conducting electricity. Then we have cells that isolate this they have a membrane that isolates the interior of the cell, the nucleus and the mitochondria, from the extracellular environment. It's composed of oily sort of layer of oil, fat, basically. And it contains then these ion channels that let through ions in and out of the cells, and that generates a current across the membrane. And that's what I measure. So we have specific amplifiers that we can measure the amplitude of the current. So if you have a copper wire, for example, it has a large current. If you have a log of wood, like a small current. If you have a blob of fat, a layer of fat, cell membrane itself, it conducts no currents. But if you put ion channels in it, we do get some currents. And here, for example, the amplifiers and methods are so good, so we can measure single ion channel opening and closing. So here you see channels are closed, channels open, flicker open and closed. So that's basically what we do. And the biology that we do is we have your channel gene. We can introduce the specific mistake there in the laboratory. We give the channel gene then to specific cells that very faithfully then generate the ion channel protein and put it in the membrane of the cell. And then we can do our electrophysiology. We place a fine glass electrode into the cell or attached to the membrane. And with our amplifier, we then can go and measure the currents going through the cell membrane. Then you have the control gene, or if you have the different the genes with the different variants, we have given the cells genes that have different variants. And we can easily tell then that this is the control DNA. This mistake in the gene causes full loss of function, so we don't get any currents if we give that gene with that mistake. Or here these channels with these mistakes, they are overreactive compared to the control. So basically my work then is to issue a report on the different mistakes. So it's an extension of the genetic service, basically. Advise the geneticists and clinicians if and how the variant alters channel function, if the variant is pathogenic or if it's not in my setting, so if further genetic tests are needed. And it also has implications to inheritance patterns. So we can say that some functional features are associated with dominant inheritance, some functional features are associated with recessive inheritance. And yeah, while doing that, we are trying to improve the service to better interpret the functional findings of the different variants and find novel genes associated with skeletal muscle channelopathies.